welcome to everyone. It's a pleasure and a real honor for me to welcome Admiral James Stavridis and Secretary Justin Muzinich tonight. They'll be in conversation to discuss Jim's most recent, the newly released and highly acclaimed book that he's co-written with Elliot Ackerman, 2004, A Novel of the Next World War. And this is a chilling, page-turning geopolitical tale of a war that is not beyond at all the realm of possibility. It's really a warning shot across the bow of how strategic miscalculations can lead to catastrophic consequences in the form of cyber warfare. And I'm just going to quote Jim Mattis, the former Secretary of Defense, who kind of blurbed this book, and he said, "War with China is the most dangerous scenario facing us in the world. Absent a strategic method to manage our differences, Jim Stavridis and Elliot Ackerman's chilling novel presents a realistic series of miscalculations leading to the worst consequences, the sobering cautionary tale for our time." So Admiral Stavridis has captivated Bookhampton audiences in the past, and I know he'll do so again tonight. He's a four-star admiral who was the Supreme Allied Commander at NATO and previously commanded U.S. Southern Command. He served 5 years as the Dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts, and he's now an operating executive with the Carlyle Group and chair of the Board of Counselors of McCarty Associates. He's published 9 prior books, all nonfiction, including Sea Power, The History and Geopolitics of the World's Oceans, and Sailing True North, 10 Admirals and the Voyage of Character. 2034 is his first novel. Secretary Justin Muzinich served as Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Treasury in the Trump administration, managing the Treasury's national security portfolio. He was, prior to that, the policy director for Jeb Bush's campaign and has been an adjunct professor at Columbia Business School. So really welcome to both of you, and thank you for being with us tonight. So now over to you.
Terrific. Well, thank you very much, Carolyn, for having us. I'm delighted to be here with you, and especially with Admiral Stavridis, who's been a friend for 15 years and really over time become a close friend. Not only is he sort of an accomplished admiral, but an accomplished academic and an accomplished writer. And I can't think of anyone I'd rather sort of be in conversation with about this topic. I think you gave a terrific introduction of the Admiral. So with that, why don't I just turn it over to him to go through a few slides, and then we can start a conversation.
Justin, Mr. Secretary, thank you very much. Carolyn, I wish with all my heart I was in Bookhampton with you, but this summer we'll do it, and it'll be terrific. Let me, if I could, for the audience, just show a couple of images to kind of get us started and kind of set up the book for you. So, you know, the typical question people ask every author is, well, why did you write the book? So right now you should be looking at some covers from some beautiful works of art, both books and film, from the Cold War. Because what led me to write this book was looking ahead to the possibility of war with China, but really looking in the rear view mirror, looking at history and thinking about the Cold War. And I'm old enough to remember the Cold War, and I remember the literature and the film of the Cold War. Films like Dr. Strangelove, books like The Bedford Incident, Failsafe, The Third World War by Sir John Hackett, or Red Storm Rising by Tom Clancy. These are books that imagined how terrible a war between the United States and the Soviet Union might be. They were cautionary tales. And I think if we can imagine our way into the future and see how destructive and terrible it could be, we can then walk our way back reverse engineer it, if you will, and avoid a conflict like that. So with that as preamble, let me simply point out where we have failed to imagine. We failed to see Pearl Harbor coming. We failed to see 9/11 coming. Who could have imagined a 20-year war in Afghanistan? Or the very fact that we're on Zoom tonight, who could have imagined a pandemic that has locked us down for a year? So this idea of imagining our way into the future in order to, again, foresee what is possible at the dark end of the spectrum so that we can come back to the present and do better. Which kind of brings us to the premise of the novel. It's about a war between the United States and China in the 10 to 15-year future. And I get the question a lot, is that realistic? US and China were so intertwined with our trade and our economics. Europe 100 years ago, 1914, was utterly intertwined, not only economically, the royal families, the ruling families were related by blood. Queen Victoria was the aunt to the Kaiser, yet they managed to sleepwalk into a war. So today we have China, who has created a very vibrant, intelligent, smart, strategic concept called One Belt, One Road. Very simple. It foresees sending finished goods out, bringing raw materials back, and along that belt and road, which you see here on this slide, creating political influence. It's a clever strategy. It also has created, both from the US and the Chinese side, real disagreements between the US and China. This is something Secretary Muzinich dealt with as Deputy Secretary of the Treasury. Bottom right, trade and tariffs. Upper right, rising Chinese naval capability. Upper left, cyber, where we are already in a shadowy war. Bottom left, the construction of artificial islands all around the South China Sea to try and claim it. And speaking of claiming things, how about the 5G networks? Will Huawei, a company deeply embedded in the fabric of the Chinese Communist Party, own that world or not? So there are significant disagreements. As an admiral, I'm going to tell you, we ought to be watching the rise of China. Here's something that may surprise you. China has more warships today than the United States of America. China has the largest combatant navy in the world. Now, admittedly, our ships are bigger. They can operate further. We have more nuclear power, much more capability, but numbers, quantity have a quality all their own. So watch that rising Chinese Navy. And here is where they will use it, in the South China Sea. The book, the novel 2034, opens in the South China Sea with an American flotilla, 3 destroyers, cutting across those disputed waters, and they are disputed. This is a vast body of water. You see the red line there. China claims all of that as territorial waters. To give you a sense of perspective here, that water space is the size of half of the United States. Think Mississippi River to California. If you want a water comparison, it's the same size roughly as the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea combined. Yet they claim it as territorial waters. It's a preposterous claim. These are international waters, but China firmly believes they own the South China Sea. It's a point of significant dispute. Neither side is going to back down. And as you get into that 10 to 15 year future, as you get toward 2034 over my right shoulder there, you're going to find more and more real collisions at sea. How about here in cyberspace? We see China very active just in the last few weeks, an attack on the Microsoft exchanges where emails move back and forth between, for example, defense contractors and the Pentagon. This is a very real Chinese capability. And human rights is going to be another significant disagreement between these two superpowers. Upper left is Carrie Lam, the Chinese factotum who runs Hong Kong. Upper right is the so-called umbrella revolution in Hong Kong. It has been crushed. Down at the bottom are Uyghurs, Muslims within China who are being herded into what many have called, I think quite accurately, concentration camps. This is a significant violation of human rights, another disagreement between our nations. And perhaps most dangerously, there's the future of Taiwan. That's the flag of Taiwan, a proud island nation. And some of you may think, oh, Taiwan is just a little island, you know. Hey, Taiwan has 35 million people. It is the 32nd largest economy in the world. It is not insignificant. It is the largest manufacturer of chips that go into all of our hardware today. And it is I would call it a nation, a political entity that has been very aligned with the United States for decades. It would be, in my view, unconscionable for the United States to simply walk away and let China embrace Taiwan. This will be another flashpoint going forward. And then lastly, as we look at China, we should recognize that the Chinese and the Russians are drawing closer and closer and closer together. Bottom left, largest military exercise since the end of the Cold War, conducted on the Siberian border. Those are Russian and Chinese troops hugging each other. Bottom right, even more ominously, this is a Chinese frigate, a Russian destroyer operating together. Not perhaps where you would expect them in the North Pacific, but in the Baltic Sea, in the heart of Europe. We also ought to be mindful that China is closing in on Iran. This is the green. You see the Persian Empire at its largest extent. Iran sees itself as an imperial power, a civilization. China is playing that card and has just signed a $200 billion down payment to Iran for their participation in One Belt, One Road. I would also point out the role of India in this complex geopolitical equation. Here there's some good news. India, as it looks at being surrounded by Iran and Pakistan, China coming into the Indian Ocean, India is seeking to draw closer to the United States. This is the golden temple of Amritsar, sacred to the Sikh faith of India. India and how it comes out in its relationships with the West, with the United States, with Europe, will be a significant geopolitical factor. We explore all of that in 2034, the novel. So right about now, you ought to be saying, well, okay, Admiral, what do you think? Are we destined for war with China in the 10 to 15-year future? I hope not. We still have time to avoid it. And so I'll close by describing what we could do to avoid it. Number one, we could learn more about China. I assure you, from decades of personal experience with the Chinese, they know much more about us than we know about them. We ought to be reading books. You ought to get to Bookhampton and buy some of them. Here are a few ideas, including bottom left, a novel about China by a Chinese-American writer, Ha Jin, one of the most lyrical writers in English today, describing tensions in China today. Do we still need a strong, capable military? Yes, we do. But I would argue we need to reshape the military of the United States if we're going to be prepared to face China. It'll look like this. Now, I assure you, this is a very bad movie. I highly do not recommend it. It's a brilliant novel, and it's about cyber and cyber warfare and about depending on the young in a society. Our military needs to reshape itself perhaps somewhat away from these massive troop formations, more toward maritime, long-range air, unmanned platforms, space, satellites, and cyber. We're going to need to work with allies, partners, and friends. Here's a good example of it. This is the coalition against the Islamic State. This is something the Obama administration started. The Trump administration continued and supported. It is a bipartisan sense that if the United States is going to deal effectively with challenges in the world, like the Islamic State, like the rise of China, we need to do it with formal alliances like NATO, but also coalitions. And then finally, as I conclude here and hand it off to Secretary Muzinich, private-public cooperation and engagement is going to be critical, because unlike Soviet times, unlike the Cold War, when there was really no engagement between the United States and NATO and the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, today is very different. We are deeply integrated with China economically. Many of our supply chains run through China. Many of China's supply chains come from the United States. Therefore, this basket of private companies are going to be crucial. I often say in dealing with China, the government is the tip of that iceberg. The mass of the iceberg in the end will be the private sector. Hey, we got to get this right, because the chances of a true great power collision in my novel between the US and China, but Russia is floating around out there. India is a nuclear power and a rising power. This is more complicated than the bipolar world we knew in the Cold War. We've got to get this right. And the seas are going to be choppy. And I think as we head toward 2034, we need to employ all the elements of US national power and hope that China is willing to do the same in ways that can avoid the outcomes we've talked about, like this. That's a Tomahawk missile. It can fly 1,500 miles, and it's so accurate, we can choose to fly it through the front window or the back door of Bookhampton. Let's not go there. Let's find a way to avoid it. And here's a scene from Dr. Strangelove, where Peter Sellers, who plays many of the characters in the film, is the president of the United States. He's calling his opposite number. They're discussing a truly dire situation. Let's hope we don't end up in that world. And let's hope that 2034 remains a cautionary tale. It debuted number 6 on the New York Times bestseller list. And I think, and I hope, it'll be read by many who will think about, again, how we can avoid this war, because it is a looming tower and we need to think through how we avoid it. Well, with that, I will turn it over to Secretary Muzinich and stop sharing the screen. So Justin, over to you, sir.
Very well. Thanks, Admiral, for a very provocative presentation. And let me just say, I think the country is enormously lucky to have a novel by two people who are so thoughtful and well-versed in the U.S. Strategic posture and in military affairs. And it's just the right time for a novel like this. So let's start with current events. There was a well-reported meeting between the Biden administration and the Chinese, which some people thought went okay. Many thought it was not a good start to the relationship. What would your advice be to the Biden administration in terms of specific next steps?
Yeah, let's get everyone on the same sheet of music. So last Thursday in Alaska, our Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, good friend of mine, and our our National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, with whom I have a cordial relationship and know him well, former director of the policy planning staff at State Department, two very experienced diplomatic interlocutors. Tony Blinken was Deputy Secretary of State previously. Jake was at State running the policy planning staff. Same job George Kennan had. The two of them met with their counterparts in Alaska. It was supposed to be a very quick opener, kind of 5 minutes on each side to lay out a few issues. And then we would send the press away, close the doors, and have an opening conversation. It didn't go that way. The Chinese chose to launch into a 20-minute broadside, deeply condemning the United States, broadly speaking. And listen, whether you are on the right or the left politically, if you listen to the transcript of how these senior Chinese officials, including the Minister of Foreign Affairs, portrayed the United States, you would feel a certain level of animus toward China. Predictably, Secretary Blinken called the press back in at that point. They had left following the Chinese statement, and he and Jake then unleashed a similar broadside. So I'm kind of two minds on this one, Justin. I think that it is always better to keep those kind of disputes behind closed doors, away from the media. On the other hand, as the saying goes from Mario Puzo's The Godfather, one of the great books of leadership ever written, don't make the mistake of hating your enemies. It clouds your judgment. I'd extend that to don't make the mistake of being deeply critical in public. And so I think it was a start that was understandable in how it played out, but probably won't be terribly helpful going forward. Now, here's the good news. Following this exchange of broadsides, they did send the press away. They closed the doors, and the four of them spent, by all accounts, 2 to 3 hours kind of addressing the differences in the issues. No announcement of a summit between President Biden and President Xi. I'd score it a B in terms of how it could have gone. Better would have been a closed door session with a sense that we were going to get two leaders together within 30 to 60 days. So an acrimonious start. And if you go back to the image I showed a minute ago about, the choppy seas, I think they are going to be very choppy over the next 6 to 12 months. As we get past that, I'm actually thinking we're going to have a relatively calmer period. It's that longer term 10 to 15 year future I'm more concerned about that we talk about in the book. So bumpy start. We'll see how it goes in the near term. Doesn't change my concern about the long-term disagreements between these two nations.
Thanks. Well, let me ask one question then on a long-term issue. In your slides, you referenced Taiwan. Neil Ferguson had a very thoughtful piece, the historian, out today, and it more or less made the argument that conflict over Taiwan, if the US's position doesn't change, seems inevitable. What do you think the right strategic posture is on Taiwan for the US?
So I know Neil very well, and you may have noticed he quoted me and the book a couple of times in the piece. In fact, the piece concludes, I think, by saying that the only thing that may be inaccurate about 2034 is the date, meaning it might be much sooner. And as recently as last week, we saw 4-star Admiral Phil Davidson, the current commander of Indo-Pacific Command, testify to his view that a war over Taiwan is very possible in the next 5 years. That ought to worry all of us. And if there is an immediate and obvious flashpoint, it would be Taiwan. So what's my prescription? I would commend to people the paper, and you've probably seen it, Mr. Secretary, put together by Robert Blackwell and Bob Zellick for the Council on Foreign Relations. And it lays out kind of like 3 or 4 options for how the US ought to approach the situation in Taiwan. I think we should not recognize them as an independent nation, nor should we push them toward independence. Down that path doth a war lie. On the other hand, I think we should increase the level of capable military defensive systems we are willing to sell to them. And those include missile defense, cyber, unmanned surveillance vehicles, both in the air and on the ocean depths. We should also, in my view, this is more controversial, conduct more training and exercises, military to military. I think we should increase the number of high-level visits. I don't see the president or the vice president going there, probably not the Secretary of State, but I would put good money that fairly soon you're going to see Dr. Kurt Campbell go there. Not super well known, but Kurt is one of the most well-known Americans in Asia. He was the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asia. His wife, Lael, worked in Treasury, as you know, Justin, in the international job. He is very well known. I think sending him to Taiwan would be a very strong signal. I think you'll see that fairly soon. We should also be saying behind closed doors to the Chinese, look, you don't want a war about this. We don't want a war about this. Let's kind of stay where we are for the moment. Whether China agrees to that or over the next 5 years, as many of my contemporaries who are on active duty and 4-star grade would tell you, they see storm clouds on the horizon. Bottom line, we ought to draw closer to Taiwan, send signals to China. I think it's probably time to take some of the ambiguity out of what has been called the strategic ambiguity that we show toward Taiwan. In other words, demonstrate more clearly to China that while we are not pushing Taiwan toward independence, on the other hand, we will not tolerate a military attack on Taiwan. And that is scary stuff. But I think if you don't go down that path, you really turn the South China Sea and all of those nations over to China in the end.
Thanks very much. Wondering if you've heard from any of your former Chinese counterparts about the book, or if you're just aware of what the reaction has been in China generally.
Well, someone asked me the other day, Carolyn, you'll love this question. If I could force one person to read the book, who would it be? That's a great question to ask an author, right? And for me, that person would be President Xi. And mostly because if I could just get like a snapshot of him holding the book, think how many tens of millions of copies I could sell in China. Yes, I've heard from my Chinese counterparts. I know many Chinese diplomats from my days as a student at the Fletcher School. One of my classmates is one of the 3 or 4 most senior Chinese diplomats. I've heard from a number of senior Chinese military officers, retired, who were contemporaries of mine. You know, and the response is, I think, predictable in the sense that, you know, Admiral, we're not looking for a war. Your book is pushing both these nations toward a war that doesn't have to happen. If only you understood that we really own the South China Sea. If only you understood that the Uyghurs are an internal population. If only you understood that Taiwan is a renegade province. So I don't think I'm changing any minds in China, but I'm hopeful that the book will have the same salutary effect there that I think it will have here, which is that despite our differences, the prospects of a real conflict, a hot war between these nations, are intolerable for both countries in so many ways. And, you know, a couple of my previous books, Carolyn was nice enough to mention Sea Power, the History and Geopolitics of the World's Oceans. That's been published in 14 different countries, including China. And I'm told that it's reasonably well regarded there. It takes a pretty even-handed, balanced approach between the two nations. And again, I'll close with this. If we're going to construct a relationship with China that avoids a war, the way to do that is for all of us to learn more about China, to try and put ourselves in their shoes. Doesn't mean we're going to agree with their positions, but we will be far better served as we try and find ways to avoid this conflict.
Thanks. Let me turn to another theme of the book, which you mentioned, cyber. I lived through a publicly reported very severe cyber attack at Treasury, as did a number of government agencies a few months ago. And it's a big part of your book, I think, for very good reasons. How vulnerable do you think we are to a very severe cyber attack on the military side, not sort of these minor attacks which happen all the time, but really a severe one? And what is there to do about it, given that we are ever more dependent on networks?
Let's start with military vulnerabilities. I'm quite confident our ultra high-end systems, particularly our strategic nuclear systems, are safe. And I won't go into specifics of that, but they are extremely safe. Kind of the next tier down is our forward warfighting capability. So think our carrier strike groups, our joint strike fighters flying around the Arabian Gulf, our troops in Afghanistan. They are reasonably well protected. And this is where the National Security Agency and particularly U.S. Cyber Command, the combatant commander, the 4-star officer, Paul Nakasone is his name. This is where they are truly focused, is ensuring that our forward systems can operate. Below that, you have a vast apparatus in the Department of Defense, which is, kind of 2 million people, is a $700 billion revenue corporation. It's, by some accounts, the largest organization in the world today. It has a lot of vulnerability. Bases in Texas, garden variety water supply systems to ships getting ready to get underway. There's a lot of vulnerability simply because the threat services are so vast and our defensive mechanisms are focused at the next tier up on those more frontline and exquisite systems. So what should we do about that? First of all, we need to harden ourselves at the lower tier of that system, and that simply is a matter of resources. It's more teams, it's more people. I would argue, Justin, it includes the creation of a cyber force. I think one of the things I commend the Trump administration for doing was creating a space force. It was time to have a space force. It is way past time to have a cyber force. And it doesn't have to be big. 15,000 men and women in a department of 2 million people, a budget of 10 to 20 billion. This is very manageable, can even be done internally from Department of Defense resources. But we need a portion of the department 100% focused every minute of the day throughout their careers on cyber. So I think that's part of it. That'll help harden that third tier I spoke about. Secondly, we need to be communicating to Russia and China primarily that there is a cost to be had if you come after our military and that we will respond in kind. In other words, we have to have the offensive cyber tools to demonstrate if you come at us, we will come at you. This is sort of taking the old nuclear weapons paradigm and pulling it into the world of cyber. And I think that's appropriate for us to do. And then third and finally, there's a big private-public portion of this. You may know this, but I bet a lot of listeners will be surprised to hear that the Department of Defense has 200,000 contractors who supply it goods and services. The so-called defense industrial base has 200,000 suppliers, the vast majority of whom are not well protected in cyber, are communicating constantly with the Pentagon, and represent an enormous level of threat surface. So one thing the Trump administration did as it left, and I hope the Biden administration will continue, is creating a series of protocols for, okay, if you want to do business with the Department of Defense, terrific, would love to have you. Here are the cyber requirements that you have to meet before we're going to let you email someone in the Pentagon, before we're going to send you a request for a speculation, a request for purchase. All of that has to be done, end-to-end encryption. We don't have time to go into all of it, but there is a significant portion of this that the Department of Defense can do, but the private sector is going to have to be involved as well.
Terrific. Well, I think we're going to turn it over to the audience in 2 minutes here. So let me end with a fun question, which is, the book is a real page turner. It feels to me like it'd be a terrific movie. Who would you like to star in the movie?
Well, anyone who knows me would say, I know you're in that book somewhere, Admiral, and Danny DeVito would be just terrific to play you. I was hoping for Brad Pitt, but in all seriousness, we haven't quite got to the casting, but I will give you a scoop tonight. And that's that I got a call about 3 weeks ago from the head of a major, and I mean a major studio complex in Hollywood. And he said, look, I just have one question about the book. Should we make it a movie or should we do it as a miniseries? I said miniseries because it's all about the characters. And, I'll close with this. For those of you who are thinking, it's just another Red Storm Rising, it's another Tom Clancy story. This is not Tom Clancy. The technology is, in many ways kind of off the stage. This is a novel of characters. It's got a wonderful woman Commodore who's driving her destroyers through the South China Sea and has 3 ships shot out from underneath her in the first 10 pages of the book. It's got a young Marine fighter pilot whose aircraft mysteriously is forced down over Iran. It's got a national security advisor, deputy, Indian-American Sandy Chowdhury, divorced dad, complications with his mother and his mother-in-law, trying to manage our national security. One of the most compelling characters is a Chinese admiral named Lin Bao, who I identify with more than anybody else in the book. He's Chinese with some American parentage in his background. He is trapped in a desk job in Washington as the film opens. All he wants to do is get back to sea, to take command again, to be out in the international environment. His great ambition after he leaves naval service is to become a teacher, a professor, something I did. There's a lot to like about Lin Bao. There's even an Iranian 1-star Quds Force general who's got a very dark side, but also, a complicated and kind of compelling backstory that my co-author really worked and wrote into the book, because Elliot Ackerman, combat Marine, CIA officer, Silver Star recipient, serious war hero. He was in these forever wars on the ground. The character of this Iranian general is the mirror image of Elliot Ackerman. This is a very character-driven book. So when we get to casting, I will have some good ideas for you. But if they want to put me in the movie, Danny DeVito. All right, I think we're ready to open it up for a few more questions.
Thank you, Admiral. Thank you, Secretary. Yes, we do have some questions rolling in from our audience. And if you haven't sent in a question yet, just a reminder, you can use the chat box function of your Zoom screen, bottom right-hand corner. One of these questions, Admiral, has to do with your writing. What was it like to write fiction after the many nonfiction books which you have already published?
Oh, it was so wonderful is the short answer. Because when you write nonfiction, you're in the straitjacket of fact. You got to be accurate. You got to footnote things if you're going to be serious. You have to have a very serious bibliography. You have to be double-checked and fact-checked. It's really like writing in a straitjacket. And if I could flip the question slightly, people have asked me, well, why didn't you just write, like a policy book about how terrible a war with China would be and how to avoid it? And I could have done that, and that would have been my 10th nonfiction book. But I wanted to bring characters into it because I think, I'd encourage everybody on the call to think about what's my favorite book. And I can tell you in a microsecond mind, it's Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. That's because I'm an old man and I spent a lot of time on the sea. But it's always been my favorite book from when I was 15 years old and read it. I've read it, 10 times. And I can't tell you the exact plot line or what happens first and second and third, but boy, do I remember Santiago the fisherman. This man of extraordinary resilience and courage and humility and an instinctive mentor to the next generation of fishermen. Hemingway said, a man can be destroyed but not defeated. Pretty good line. And characters are who we remember, and I think they rattle around in our head. So I wanted to write fiction. And that's the biggest difference, is that you get to bring characters into a novel. And they become, if Eliot were here, he would say, the characters, you create them, and then they come and they stand at your desk and they make their case. And your job as a writer is to tell their story and give them the stage. I think this was Shakespeare, right? All the world's a stage, and everything was so character driven in Shakespeare. And if you go to the arena stage, it's just, a big, not even big, it's a small, empty, flat stage. The characters drive it. And that's what I learned writing fiction. And I'll give you a scoop. I just signed a 2-book novel deal with my publisher for sequels to the book. So more characters and more fiction ahead. I love writing fiction. I'll finish by saying, I think most people who write nonfiction books wake up in the morning, look in the mirror and say, I could be a novelist. I know I can write a novel. And I just needed a Sherpa, and I was so lucky that Elliot Ackerman would be that Sherpa. I've learned a lot writing this book, and it won't be my last foray into the world of fiction. Thanks for a great question.
We're so happy to hear that. Another question: if you were Jim Locker doing another Goldwater-Nichols act for the wars of 2034 and after, what would you do to prepare the defense system well?
Yeah, so just to get everyone on the same sheet of music, a man named Jim Locker was pivotal in a number of big defense ideas in the 70s, 80s, really creating the idea of what is called jointness. This is where the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Coast Guard, et cetera, all work together. And it created the Goldwater-Nichols Act, which was an act of law that forced the Army, Navy, and Air Force, principally, and Marine Corps, of course, to come together and to cross-train their officers and their enlisted people, and to send them back and forth to different war colleges to study the other services. It brought the military together, and that's been very successful. That's been very successful. What the question is getting at correctly is, what's the next step of that? And it's to create a way in which the interagency can work more effectively together. And in a minute, I'm going to ask Secretary Muzinich to comment on this, because he lived the interagency for the last 2 to 3 years. My experience in the interagency, observing it from the Pentagon, is that it is still an unintegrated process in so many ways. I think we're somewhat better than we were 20 or 30 years ago, but trying to get the Department of Defense, Department of Treasury, Department of State, USAID, Department of Justice, CIA, getting everybody on the same sheet of music is very, very hard. And so I think Jim Locker would agree, and he pushed ideas about how we could bring the interagency, all the branches of government, together more effectively. And we still got, my view, a ways to go on that, but Secretary Muzinich may have a more recent view of that. Justin?
No, I agree with that. I think interagency coordination is, one of the big challenges. It's done really by the NSC through the National Security Council process, which Treasury is a member, and so I would see it on a weekly basis. And I think there's a lot of work to do there. I think one of the biggest challenges is making sure that the country's priorities, really the president's priorities, are always pushed through the interagency. So if priority number one is China, when you're thinking about Europe or Venezuela, for instance, making sure that you're thinking through how does what we do in Europe or Venezuela affect sort of our Chinese strategic priorities, and making sure that priorities really get pushed through all the agencies is something that really requires work.
Yeah, let me add another thought and bring it to the Biden administration. So the National Security Council is actually the president, the vice president, the Secretary of Defense, Treasury, State, a couple of others, Homeland Security. President Biden has chosen to add to the National Security Council former Secretary of State John Kerry to bring the idea of dealing with the challenges of climate into the very highest levels of government. I think that's a smart choice. There are going to be those who say, oh, climate, that's not that important. I think it is very important from a national security perspective, not only to deal with the elements of climate, but because if we're going to work with China and work with India, a significant component of doing so is going to be how we relate to them in a climate area. And frankly, climate is one of the few areas where I could see cooperation between the US and China. So that's an example of what Secretary Muzinich is describing, is bringing together these disparate views, because at that National Security Council table, DOD, Department of Defense, will be saying China, bad, dangerous, enemy. State will be saying human rights violations, can't give them the South China Sea. Department of Homeland Security will probably be saying, hey, in terms of China, what about these Confucius institutes around the country, espionage? Secretary Kerry will be saying, but wait a minute, we need to think about how we can cooperate with them. And that, I think, will be a very interesting dynamic that'll play out in this interagency process. But the point is, I think both the Secretary and I would agree, it's a herky-jerky process. It is anything but smooth. It's very personality-driven. And when you confront the really big issues, like China, it kind of crowds out other really important issues, like Venezuela. Who's got time to think about Venezuela? Yet that's a huge issue here in the hemisphere. But the limited time of the principals to deal with this in the White House is a very constraining factor. So bottom line, we got to get better and more efficient at the interagency process.
Thank you. On the introductory slides that were shown, there were various nation flags. I did not see Japan, says our audience. Why not? Mm-hmm. And can you speak to the future of Japan in 2034?
Yes. Let me add to the fact that you don't see a bunch of the NATO nations in the novel either. You don't see any European nations engaged in this US-China conflict. My assessment is that by 2034, if the United States does not tend the garden of its allies, partners, and friends, we will be alone and unafraid, I hope, but probably kind of afraid of China. So the fact that you didn't see Japan, you didn't see Great Britain, you didn't see France, you didn't see Germany is a signal. And the reason is that part of the cautionary tale for the United States is be careful. These nations that we sort of assume are always going to be there with us, they have options. Believe me, they have options. And so that's the reason we don't see them. To answer the other part of the question, I think jury's out, because on Japan's future, it'll really depend on the balance between the declining demographics of Japan problem and the rising capability to deal with it with robotics, with artificial intelligence, with high-end technology. This is something, it's funny you say that, as I'm just starting to ruminate about a sequel, which will be set about 20 years beyond 2034 and 2054, there will be a role for Japan. And I think that that's because my assessment is that although the demographics will not favor Japan, the technology will. And, you know, Japan is almost less of a front and center thought for us in the United States today. We think all the time about China and Russia, somewhat about the European Union. We think about India. You know, Japan is the third largest economy in the world. It is a high-tech center. It is a deep ally and friend to the United States of America. We should spend more time thinking about Japan. They will make an appearance in the next book. Thanks.
All right.
I think we have time for one more.
All right. So there's a question here. Given 5G's supposed effects on GPS accuracy and other potential problems, are there options that we should be looking at, or other options we should be looking at?
Well, I believe that we cannot turn over 5G to China. And that means not turning it over to a Chinese juggernaut like Huawei. And I think you're going to see the Biden administration continue on with the Trump administration policy of saying to our allies, partners, and friends, be very, very careful before you build your 5G with a Chinese system underpinning it. And the reason for that is the propensity, the ability to insert a variety of backdoors, the way in which Chinese corporations, entities, some state-owned, some highly influenced by the military, even the purely commercial ones, are really under the thumb of the government. That's just a reality. We need to remember, in China, we think here about capitalism and the government with a level of regulation. In China, it's really capitalism up to a point when the state decides it wants to do what it wants to do. And, you know, it's like in Ghostbusters, you really don't want those streams to cross. They've crossed in Beijing. And so you have to question whether you want to turn over these 5G networks to a Chinese entity. And I think that in terms of what the US should be doing, we need to strengthen our position to compete. And that's true across a wide spectrum. You know, people say to me when I talk about messaging in the world, you know, yeah, Admiral, you're right, it's a war of ideas. No, it's not a war of ideas. It's a marketplace of ideas. We have to compete. And just like we have to compete with our fundamental ideas, democracy, liberty, two different things, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of education, gender equality, racial equality. Look, we execute those values imperfectly. They're the right values. And my belief is that those ideas can compete in the world. They will compete in the world, but we have to recognize it's a marketplace. We've got to get out there and market them. And that means, by the way, demonstrating to the world that we can come together and work together inside the country. And this is probably a good place to stop, because the greatest threat that America faces is it's not China. It's what's happening inside our own country. Because I assure you, we have all the resources, all the talent, all the perfect geography in the world. We have vast oceans to the left and right. We have benign neighbors to the north and south. We have boundless arable land, fresh water. We're the largest oil and gas exporter in the world. Our universities are the envy of the world. We have Silicon Valley. We have its equivalent in biotech in the Route 128 belt around Boston. We can do this. We can do this. And I'm not a triumphalist. I don't think the United States ought to run the world, but I'm not a declinist. And I think the only thing between us and decline is inside. It is a need to find people that can reach across the aisles and work with others. And the degree to which we do that will be the degree to which we are successful in this very turbulent 21st century. Well, thanks for spending an hour with me this evening. I hope you enjoy the book, read the book, and above all, I hope you buy the book from Carolyn Brody. Go to an independent bookstore and buy this book. Mr. Secretary, last word is yours.
Well, thanks. I don't think it can be said better than that. So I will let the Admiral have the last word. Thanks for all your very thoughtful comments.
Thank you all. I salute you.
Admiral Stavridis and Secretary Muzinich, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing with us. Big congratulations, Admiral, on your new novel, 2034, A Novel of the Next World War, is out now. It's available for purchase. And as the Admiral said, please visit your independent local bookstore to pick up your copy if you haven't done so already. Signed book plates available while supplies last. Thank you all for being with us this evening, and thank you as always for supporting your local independent bookstores. Happy reading, all.
And when you open the New York Times this Sunday, you'll see it number 6 on the New York Times bestseller list. Thanks, everybody.
Have a great night.